Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive.
Yeah, welcome back.
Today we are taking a look at something pretty fundamental to all of us. Our memory.
Absolutely.
And really how to learn better without feeling overwhelmed.
Right.
Like drowning in information.
Yeah.
And we are extracting this crucial knowledge from the book, Remember Everything You Want, and Manage the Rest.
That's right.
So for you in this deep dive, we are going to get under the hood and understand the core processes of how our memory actually works.
Okay.
And then we're going to talk about some of the obstacles that our modern lives throw in the way of good memory. And then get into the really fun practical stuff.
Yeah.
Some of the actual techniques you can use to sharpen your focus.
Right.
To nail how you learn new things and recall that information when you need it.
Yeah.
We'll even touch on some smart ways to organize your knowledge and even how to learn foreign languages.
That's right. I think we're giving people a lot to look forward to in this deep dive.
Yeah. I think so. And you know this book. It's not just another summary of how memory works.
Yeah.
It's really like your personal guided tour through some of the strategies in this book to help you learn more efficiently and remember more effectively.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's just get right into it.
Sure.
How does our memory even function?
So I think the book really emphasizes the difference between short-term or working memory and long-term memory. And, you know, there's this really interesting case study that I think helps kind of illustrate the difference between the two. The case of patient HM.
Okay.
So this patient, he could experience, you know, the world around him normally and hold on to information, you know, for a little while.
Right.
But he completely lost the ability to form new long-term memories.
Oh, wow.
So he could only remember things for about 30 to 40 seconds.
Oh, wow. That's so short, 30 to 40 seconds.
I know. It's really quite remarkable. And that's why, like, sometimes if you think you forgot something, it's probably because it never really made it into your short-term memory in the first place.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
Okay, well, how does information go from our short-term memory to our long-term memory?
So it involves a few key stages. So first, information needs to grab your attention.
Okay.
So if you're not really paying attention to something, it's unlikely that you'll actually remember it.
Right.
So once it has your focus, it enters this phase of encoding where your brain is processing it into a format that can be stored.
Okay.
So it's kind of like translating it into the language of your brain.
Got it.
From there, it hangs out, you know, briefly in the short-term memory and then through, you know, further processing and consolidation.
Yeah.
Some of that information can then be transferred into the long-term memory.
Okay.
And finally, we have recall, which is actually being able to retrieve that stored information when you need it.
Okay, so attention encoding, short-term memory, long-term memory, and recall.
That's a really good summary.
That's
You got it.
Okay.
And this whole process is actually described in the book as kind of like a circle.
Yeah, they talk about these virtuous and vicious cycles.
Yeah, exactly. And so the virtuous circle basically means that when you use effective learning and memory strategies, that actually leads to better retention.
Okay.
And what's key is that then makes learning new information that's related even easier.
Oh, wow.
So you're actually making your job of learning easier as you go.
That's great.
It's kind of like you build momentum.
Awesome.
And on the other hand, we have this vicious cycle, which is, you know, when you don't use these strategies.
Right.
And so you have poor retention.
Yeah.
And that makes learning new information harder.
Right.
And it becomes harder to connect things, and it's just not...
It's not a good cycle to be in.
It's not fun.
Definitely not.
So we all want to be in that virtuous cycle.
For sure.
Because as you're learning and using these strategies, you're making future learning easier.
Yeah.
So it's like a snowball effect in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, what about forgetting?
Right.
It's something we all do all the time. What role does that play in this whole memory system?
That's a great question. So forgetting actually plays different roles in short-term and long-term memory.
Okay.
So in the short term, it acts as a filter.
Okay.
So for example, you know, when you're solving that math problem from the book, 2 times 5 minus 2.
Yeah.
You know, you only need to keep those kind of intermediate results in your short-term memory for a few seconds.
Right.
And then once you arrive at the final answer, you can just forget about those earlier steps.
Okay, so it's like our brain's way of constantly taking out the trash.
Exactly.
Short term. But what about long-term memory?
Right. So in long-term memory, forgetting isn't always about information completely vanishing.
Yeah.
It's more often about not having the right retrieval cues at that moment.
Yeah.
So you might actually know something, but you just can't access it right when you need it.
Right.
That's why, even like a small hint or a familiar smell can bring back a memory.
Right.
Because it's kind of giving you that retrieval cue.
Right.
And a good example of this is like when you walk into another room and you forget what you wanted.
All the time.
Right, because the environmental cues from where you originally had that thought are gone.
Yeah.
And so it's harder to recall your intention.
Okay, so it's not always a bad thing then?
No, not at all.
Okay.
In fact, forgetting in the long term can actually be quite beneficial.
Okay.
Because it helps us to discard information that's unused or outdated or just irrelevant.
Okay, so it's almost like decluttering for our brain.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, so to kind of recap this first part, for information to really stick and become a stable long-term memory, we need to pay attention, encode it into short-term memory, move it to long-term memory, and then have ways to recall it.
Exactly.
Okay. And forgetting can be both good and bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Now let's talk about how our modern lives really impact this whole process.
Right. I mean, with all the distractions we have these days, it's no wonder that people have trouble remembering things.
Yeah.
I think the book really highlights attention, absent-mindedness, and the myth of multitasking as really key culprits here.
Yeah, I feel like I live in a state of absent-mindedness.
Yeah.
Sometimes what even makes us so prone to it.
So a lot of times when we think we forgot something, it's not that the memory was actually lost. It's just that it never really formed in the first place because we weren't paying enough attention.
So it goes back to attention.
Exactly.
Being that first key step.
That's right.
Okay, so the book offers some tips to improve our attention.
Yes.
To those everyday tasks.
Yeah.
What are some of the tips that you thought were really helpful?
So for really simple things like, turning off the stove or putting down your keys.
Yes.
Just try verbalizing the action as you're doing it.
Okay.
So actually say out loud to yourself, I am now switching off the stove.
Okay.
And as you're doing it, look directly at the object. So you're really kind of engaging.
Engaging all your senses.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then similarly, when you put your keys down, say, I'm placing my keys on the table and actually see them there.
Okay. So I can imagine if you're doing that, you're much less likely to forget where you put them.
Exactly.
Okay, what about that thing we were talking about earlier, walking into a room and forgetting why you went there?
Oh, yeah, that happens to me all the time.
All the time. What can we do about that?
So the book recommends actually mentally retracing your steps.
Okay.
Or even physically retracing your steps. So go back to the room where you had the original thought.
Okay.
And a lot of times just being back in that environment will give you those cues to jog your memory.
Okay, so you're basically retracing your steps of intention.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about multitasking.
Right.
I feel like it's hailed as this crucial skill in our, fast-paced world.
Yeah.
But how does it actually impact memory?
Yeah, so while multitasking might seem efficient for very simple routine tasks, research has actually shown that it can be quite detrimental to your memory, especially when those tasks are more complex. And, as we talked about earlier, our short-term memory has a very limited capacity.
Right.
And so when you're trying to do multiple things at once, information from one task can actually be displaced or interfered with by, the other things that you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And that just leads to poorer performance overall.
Okay.
And the book even gives you a little experiment to try to see this in action. Try doing like a math problem in your head while you're trying to memorize like a short list of words at the same time.
Okay, so split focus.
Yeah.
See how that goes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what else impacts our attention and impacts our memory?
Preoccupations and strong emotions are really big attention distractors.
Right.
If you're really worried about work or you're excited about something, these thoughts and feelings can keep popping up. Yeah.
And distracting you and making it harder to focus on the task at hand.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of these attention-related memory failures
just
come down to not being present.
Exactly.
Not being engaged in what you're doing.
That's right.
So what are some tips then that we can use to improve our focus overall?
So, in addition to the specific tips that we talked about for everyday tasks, the book really advocates for single tasking.
Yeah.
So, try to focus on one thing at a time.
Okay.
And also minimize distractions.
Minimize distraction.
In your environment.
Got it.
Try to give your undivided attention to important tasks.
Okay.
We talked about the importance of having consistent places for your things.
Yeah.
And retracing your steps when you forget something. And I think one of the most important things is just to slow down.
Slow down.
Yeah, because when you're rushing,
yeah,
you're much more likely to make mistakes.
Right, and make those absent-minded errors.
Okay, the book also talks about time boxing as a technique to kind of sharpen that concentration.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, so time boxing is basically dedicating specific focused intervals to a particular task with breaks in between.
Okay.
So the book suggests starting with 20-minute time boxes.
20 minutes.
Yeah, or even shorter if you find that you get distracted easily.
Yeah.
And then once the timer goes off, you take a short break, about 5 to 10 minutes, and do something completely different.
Okay.
So really step away from your work.
Away from the task.
Yes.
Okay, so how do you figure out the ideal length for your time box?
So that really depends on, your personal attention span.
Yeah.
Some people can focus for longer than others.
Right.
But the book suggests starting with 20 and then just seeing how well you can maintain your concentration without getting, too distracted.
Right. If 20 minutes is too long, shorten it.
Exactly. And you can even experiment with different lengths for different types of tasks.
Right, because some tasks require more focus than others.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the important thing is to just, find a rhythm that works for you and stick to those focused work periods.
Okay.
Yeah.
Time boxing.
Wow.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to get into what the book calls the core of memory building.
Okay.
And they introduce this acronym, AVECPO.
Yeah, that's a great acronym.
I like it. It's easy to remember.
Yes, it is.
So what does it stand for?
So it stands for association, visualization, elaboration, combination, recall practice, and organization.
Okay, so a lot.
Yeah, we got a lot to unpack.
Okay, so let's start with the first one, association.
Okay.
What does association have to do with building strong memories?
So association is all about connecting new information to knowledge that you already have.
Okay.
So the more connections you can create between something new and something you already know,
yeah,
the easier it will be for you to remember it.
Got it.
So it's kind of like building a mental web.
Okay.
Right? And the more connections you have, the stronger that web becomes.
Awesome. And visualization.
Yes.
I know a lot of memory experts talk about the power of mental images.
Yeah, visualization is super powerful.
Yeah.
And it involves creating vivid images in your mind.
Yeah.
And research has shown that we tend to remember visual information much better than verbal information.
Okay.
So the book emphasizes that the key here is interaction.
Interaction.
Yeah. So for example, if you want to remember that you need to buy a Toyota and some bananas.
Okay.
Picture that Toyota running over a banana.
Okay.
Right? That's going to be more memorable than just picturing them next to each other.
Right. So almost making it a little bizarre.
Exactly. You want to make it stand out in your mind.
Okay.
And interactive images that actually explain relationships between things are especially powerful.
Okay.
And, using visualization to enhance memory. This has been around for a long time.
Really?
Yeah.
How long?
Going back to orators in ancient Greece and Rome.
Wow.
They use this to memorize really long speeches.
Wow, that's impressive. Okay, elaboration? What is that?
So elaboration is about, going beyond just surface level understanding.
Okay.
And asking yourself why.
Why?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's about really thinking about the meaning of information and connecting it to things that you already know.
Okay.
And the book talks about the self-reference effect.
Okay.
Which basically means that you remember things better when you connect them to personal experiences.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, because it makes it more meaningful to you.
Right.
So, for example, if you're trying to learn about the French Revolution, think about, how that might relate to current political movements or a historical event that you already know about.
Okay.
Just make it relevant to yourself.
Make it personal.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, what about combination?
So combination is using both visual and verbal information together.
Okay.
So, you can use images alongside text.
Yeah.
Or, create sequences of images to represent a process,
Right.
Kind of like a mental animation.
Okay, so really using words and pictures
to
paint a more vivid picture.
Exactly.
In your mind.
Yeah.
Okay, recall practice.
Yes.
That's a big one.
This is huge.
Okay.
So recall practice is basically actively trying to retrieve information from your memory.
Okay.
And the key here is that the act of retrieving information actually strengthens the memory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's not just about testing yourself.
Yeah.
It's actually making the memory stronger.
Okay, so what are some practical tips for recall practice?
So first, make sure to complete the entire test or exercise before you check the answers.
Okay.
Because delaying that feedback actually helps you to retain the information better.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And then, engaging in multiple recall tests spaced out over time is also really important.
So not just cramming it all at once?
No, definitely not. Because, if you space it out, you're basically telling your brain that this information is important.
Okay.
And you know that you need to keep it around.
Got it. And also looking for questions where you have to actively come up with an answer, not just multiple choice.
Exactly.
Short answer.
Yeah.
Okay. And then finally, organization.
Yes.
How does organization play into memory?
So organization is all about structuring information in a way that makes it easier to remember and retrieve.
Got it.
So the book suggests, using categories. Or sequences or spatial order to kind of group things together.
So you're chunking information.
Exactly.
Okay. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So, for example, let's say you're trying to memorize all the member states of the European Union.
Okay.
Instead of just trying to remember one long list, you can group the countries geographically.
Okay.
So you could have Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, and Eastern Europe.
Got it.
And then within each region, you can organize them spatially, like maybe from south to north. And, the book even mentions a trick of using an acronym like POLYLAIST to remember Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in that specific order.
Wow, that's very clever.
Yeah, and that's just one example.
Wow. So organization can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
When it comes to memory, okay, so now we've talked about the fundamental building blocks of memory. Let's talk about some mnemonics.
Yes.
Which are basically memory aids.
Yeah.
To help us remember certain types of information.
Right.
Okay, so let's start with acronyms and acrostics.
Sure.
Most people have probably heard of these at some point.
Yeah.
How do they actually help us remember things?
So, acronyms are formed by taking the first letter of each word in a list.
Okay.
And creating a new word. So like AVECPO. Right.
Great example.
And then acrostics are sentences where the first letter of each word corresponds to a word in the list.
Right.
So like, every good boy does fine for the musical notes.
Okay.
So these techniques help you to remember the items in order.
Got it.
And it transforms that really hard task of memorizing a bunch of separate things into just remembering a single word or a short sentence.
And the book also talks about using acrostics for creating strong passwords.
Yeah, that's a really cool application.
Yeah.
So the idea is to come up with a memorable sentence that incorporates a mix of words and numbers.
Okay.
But isn't something that anyone could easily guess.
Right.
And then you just take the first letter of each word and the actual digits from any numbers to form your password.
Okay.
So for example, the book has this sentence. 3 pink alligators ate 1 tiny cookie at Grandma's 2 yummy apple pies right now, dear.
Okay.
And so the acronym that's formed from that is Tapout Cag's 2 yard.
Okay. I like it.
Yeah.
And probably hard to guess.
Very hard to guess.
Okay. What about associating information using visualization, the link system?
Yes. So the link system is a great way to remember a sequence of items by creating vivid and interactive mental images. So you start with the first item on your list and you create a strong mental image for it.
Okay.
And then you link that image to the next item on the list through some kind of action.
Okay.
And you keep doing that for each item on the list.
So you're making a chain of images.
That's right.
Got it.
So the book uses the example of a shopping list.
Okay.
Fridge, milk, apples, kettle oven.
Okay.
So you might picture, opening your fridge and a giant carton of milk falls out.
Yep.
And that milk carton bursts open and apples come pouring out.
Okay.
And then those apples roll into a kettle.
Okay.
Which then transforms into an oven filled with bread.
Okay. I love it.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It's out there.
Yeah.
It's memorable.
Exactly.
Okay. What about substituting concrete items for abstract terms?
Right. So this is really useful for when you're trying to remember more conceptual things.
Okay.
So you find more concrete objects or phrases to represent those abstract ideas.
Okay.
And then you can use those concrete things to create those visualizations.
So if you're trying to remember a list of African countries, you might substitute Botswana.
Yes.
With something like the phrase boats wander.
Exactly.
And then you would link that to the next country on your list.
Right. And the book also suggests asking yourself some questions when you encounter an abstract term.
Okay, what are those?
Like, what does this word mean to me personally?
Okay.
What do I already know about it?
Got it.
What does it sound like?
Okay.
And then you can use those answers to come up with a suitable substitute.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so the keyword method. This is a mnemonic technique that's really popular for language learning.
Yeah, the keyword method is great for learning vocabulary.
Okay.
And it involves finding a keyword in the foreign language word that sounds similar to a word in your native language.
Okay.
And then you create an image that links that keyword to the meaning of the foreign word.
Got it.
So, for example, if you're trying to learn the German word for parachute,
okay,
which is Fallschirm.
Fallschirm.
Yeah. The first part, fall, sounds kind of like the English word fence.
Fence.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you might imagine a parachute getting caught on a fence.
Okay.
And that image will help you remember that Fallschirm means parachute.
Okay.
Yeah.
And finally, remembering people's names and fish names.
Right. So both of those can be tricky.
Yeah.
But the key is to pay attention when you're first introduced.
Got it.
Make sure you hear the name clearly.
Yeah.
Repeat it back to the person.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to ask them to repeat it.
Okay.
If you didn't catch it.
Got it.
You know, most people are happy to repeat their name.
Right. It shows that you care.
Exactly.
Okay. So spaced review, flashy cards, and the Sofrit method for active learning. Let's move into that.
Okay.
So spaced review is about reviewing information at increasing intervals.
Right.
So we all know that cramming for a test
Yeah.
isn't the most effective way to learn.
Yeah, it's really not.
Why is that?
So when you cram, you're not really understanding the material deeply.
Nope.
You're just trying to memorize it for the short term.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really stick in your long-term memory.
Right.
And then when you need that information later,
Yeah.
it's gone.
It's gone.
Yeah. And plus, you know, as you learn more and more, it becomes really hard to keep track of what you know and what you don't know.
Right. And you end up wasting time reviewing stuff you already know.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So spaced review is really the antidote to cramming.
Got it.
It's much more effective.
Okay. The book talks about the Lightner box system.
Yes. So the Lightner box system is a physical method for spaced repetition.
Okay. How does that work?
So you basically have a bunch of flashcards.
Okay.
And you divide them into boxes based on how well you know them.
Okay.
So if you get a card right,
yeah,
it moves to a box where you review it less often.
Okay.
But if you get it wrong,
yeah,
it goes back to the first box where you review it more often.
Oh, so it's self-correcting.
Exactly.
I like it. Yeah. The book also talks about flashy cards, which are digital versions of flashcards.
Right. So now with computers and apps, you can actually automate this whole process.
Yeah.
So you create digital flashcards.
Okay.
And the program tracks your progress.
Okay.
And shows you the cards that you need to review more often.
Got it.
Yeah. So it's really helpful.
Very cool. And then when it comes to using flashcards for language learning, the book talks about the directionality of learning.
Yes.
And it advises against learning related new words together.
That's right.
So can you elaborate on those points a little bit?
Yeah. So directionality of learning basically means, learning from your native language to the foreign language.
Okay.
And then also from the foreign language back to your native language.
Right.
So the book suggests focusing on learning from your native language to the foreign language first.
Okay.
Because that's typically the harder direction.
Okay.
And it also helps you with retention when you're quizzed in the other direction. So once you have a good grasp of the vocabulary, then you can start testing yourself in both directions.
Got it.
And then for learning related new words together, like different types of fruits or parts of the body, the book advises against that.
Okay.
Because the similarity in their meanings can actually cause interference in your memory.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So it's almost like they're too close together.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's dive a little deeper into some strategies for learning foreign language vocabulary.
Okay.
We've already talked about spaced repetition and the keyword method,
Mm-hmm.
but what else can we do?
So the book really emphasizes learning new words in context.
Okay.
So try to learn them from, textbooks or conversations with native speakers.
Right.
And when you come across a new word, write it down.
Write it down.
Yeah, and get some example sentences.
Got it.
And the book recommends creating flashcards with the foreign language word and its pronunciation on one side, and the native language meaning on the other side.
Okay.
And try to just focus on one meaning per card to avoid confusion.
One meaning per card.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then use those flashcards for spaced repetition.
Okay, so what makes a good vocabulary flashcard then?
So a good flashcard will focus on just one meaning of the word.
Okay.
It will include pronunciation, and it will have a relevant image.
Okay.
So you're kind of engaging multiple senses.
Okay. And we talked about the enhanced keyword method earlier briefly.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So it's similar to the regular keyword method.
Okay.
But you also choose a specific object or location in the target language's country.
Okay.
And you use that as an anchor for your visualization.
So like a landmark.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So for example, if you're learning Khmer words.
Khmer word.
Yeah.
Okay.
You might choose Angkor Wat as your anchor.
Angkor Wat.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then you would create images that connect the keywords and meanings to that anchor.
Okay, so you're really grounding the words in a place.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about mental filing.